biography of Adamantius. His name comes now and again in the literature on Jerome, but not only in Jerome. I would like to mention his wonderful commentary on the Epitaphium Sancte Paule, which is really a masterpiece of patristic philology and commentary literature. But he has not only an interest for Jerome, since he has worked also on Greek patristics, more recently on Greek hagiography. He has just published a book on the Greek text of the Historia Monacorum. And among his interests, his larger interest also, not only as a philologist, as a historian of literature, he will be, since next fall, the director of the Journal of Late Antiquity. So it is my pleasure again to invite him to give this lecture on Jerome's appropriation of Origen in his Pauline Commentaries and the architecture of exegetical authority.
Well, thank you, Lorenzo. Before I begin, I want to say a special thanks to Gloria. Where are you? There we go. And to the rest of the organizational committee for being magnificent hosts, especially to those of us for whom this is the first time in Jerusalem. I also do want to say that it's a great privilege of mine, a personal privilege, to share the dais with Hello Newman, who not only is one of the world's leading Jerome scholars, but also an old friend, so it's a special treat to do that. Finally, I would like to thank all of you for coming today. I realize we're all tired after a wonderful conference, so thank you for joining us for that last little sprint across the finish line. Or maybe a slow walk across the finish line. We'll see. Okay, so let me go ahead and begin my talk, which deals with the reception of Origen with Jerome, which is probably all of us know was quite problematic in many respects. I'm going to be looking at a moment in Jerome's reception of Origen earlier on in his career when it wasn't so problematic for him. Until the middle of the 4th century AD, the exegesis of Paul's epistles had been monopolized by commentators writing in Syriac and Greek. Then in the space of half a century, between the early 360s and 409, there appeared no less than 52 Pauline commentaries in Latin by 6 different authors: Marius Victorinus, Ambrosiaster, Jerome, Augustine, the unknown writer we call the Budapest Anonymous, and Pelagius. To this unprecedented burst of Latin language exegetical activity, Jerome contributed 4 commentaries on Paul, on his epistles, on Philemon, Galatians, Ephesians, and Titus. These 4 commentaries, which he wrote in quick succession in the summer of 386, occupy a very significant place in his literary career for at least 3 reasons. First, they were his first literary productions after settling into Bethlehem, where he would live for the next 3.5 decades until his death in 420. Second, they constitute his first foray into systematic exegesis of whole biblical books. Third, and most important for our purposes today, they offer an excellent case study in how Jerome appropriated Origen's legacy as a biblical commentator, as he tried to forge his own way forward as a biblical commentator. Now, as Jerome himself openly acknowledged, Origen was his chief exegetical model for his Pauline commentaries. In fact, that's not the comparison of the surviving fragments of Origen's commentaries with the corresponding parts of Jerome's shows just how extensive Jerome's indebtedness to Origen in fact was. Today, though, I want to focus not on his actual dependence on Origen, but rather on the nuances of how he rhetorically represents that dependence to his readers in 2 of the prefaces to his Pauline commentaries. We begin with the commentary on Galatians, which Jerome divided into 3 books, each of which has its own very elaborate literary preface. So if you'll pull your handout out now. So this is a half high-tech lecture. There at least is a handout, no PowerPoint. So for this first passage, you'll notice that I've divided this, I have the Latin here and the English translation down below, but you'll notice that the first section is in boldface, the next part is in regular font, and the third part is underscored. We're going to be looking at each of these sections one by one. So we're going to be looking at the first one now, and it reads, and this is in the boldface, I shall undertake a work not attempted before me by writers in our language and executed by only a very choice few of the Greeks themselves in a manner warranted by the grandeur of the subject matter. I'm not unaware that Gaius Marius Victorinus, who taught rhetoric at Rome when I was a boy, produced commentaries on the apostle. However, because he was engrossed in erudition and secular literature, he was completely ignorant of the scriptures. And nobody, no matter how eloquent he may be, is able to discuss competently what he does not know. We have to admit there's a certain charm to Jerome that gotta love the guy. Or not. So in this passage, Jerome takes direct aim at someone whom he configures as his arch-rival in Pauline interpretation. Marius Victorinus, the Neoplatonist philosopher and professor of rhetoric at Rome, who converted to Christianity in the late 350s, near the end of his life. After his conversion, he became the first Latin-speaking Christian on record to compose commentaries on Paul's epistles. And he wrote commentaries, we're not sure if he wrote commentaries on the entire Pauline corpus, but we do know commentaries on Galatians, Philippians, Ephesians, Romans, and 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Now, in this preface, Jerome's stated objection to Victorinus' work on Paul is, quite simply, its author's sheer incompetence. He was completely ignorant of the scriptures. Jerome attributes this ignorance to Victorinus' involvement with classical literature, which is a classics professor, I have to... no comment. Now, this particular comment that Jerome makes, I don't think should be taken as simply some kind of, passing allusion to anything but the secular wing to Victorinus' literary output, which included commentaries on some of Cicero's rhetorical works, translations of Aristotle's categories, and so on. So this is probably what Jerome is referring to. But if we dig a little further, what does he mean when he says that Victorinus was completely ignorant of the scriptures? In all probability, he probably did not intend this to be an arbitrary jibe or insult, but rather a substantive critique of a peculiar aspect of Victorinus' exegetical technique. Victorinus rarely cross-references the Old Testament to explain Paul, even in his commentary on Galatians, an epistle in which the Old Testament is a pervasive subtext. Modern scholars debate about whether this is due to a conscious methodological decision on Victorinus' part to interpret Paul by Paul, or to a spotty knowledge of the Old Testament. And Stephen Cooper, in his magisterial book on Victorinus' commentary on Galatians, sensibly suggests a hybrid of these two possibilities. So he acknowledges Victorinus', quote, no doubt scanty acquaintance with the Old Testament, unquote, but attributes his Paul-centeredness to an informed exegetical calculation. He says, quote, Victorinus' primary goal to explain the meaning and import of the Pauline letters for a contemporary audience could be best accomplished by explicating Paul on the basis of what Paul himself said. Now, as is well known to probably all of us, Jerome self-consciously patterned himself after walking concordances like Origen and Didymus, and all we have to do is just take a cursory glance at his Pauline commentaries to see that he ubiquitously quotes both the Old and New Testaments in order to situate Paul in the broader context of the Bible. Now, given that fact, it's understandable how somebody like Jerome may have inferred from Victorinus' limited engagement with the Old Testament that Victorinus lacked one of the fundamental skill sets for serious biblical study, a knowledge of Scripture. Now, after explicitly criticizing Victorinus for his supposed ignorance of the Bible, Jerome proceeds to make an implicit criticism of him as well. And we'll look now at the next section in plain font, number 1 on the handout. We're still looking at that same passage. Jerome says, am I then foolish or rash to promise what he was incapable of accomplishing? Not at all. I believe that I am more cautious and timid because I have recognized the scantness of my own abilities and have followed the commentaries of Origen. He wrote 5 of his own volumes on Paul's epistle to the Galatians and rounded out the 10th book of his miscellanies with a brief section expounding it. He also produced various homilies and scholia, which could have been sufficient even by themselves. I say nothing of my seeing guide Didymus, Apollinaris, who recently left the church at Laodicea, the ancient heretic Alexander, Eusebius of Emesa, and Theodore of Heraclea, all of whom have left behind modest commentaries of their own on the topic at hand. The fact that Jerome immediately follows his indictment of Victorinus with this fulsome catalog is no accident, I would argue. First of all, he conspicuously excludes Victorinus from the catalog, thereby implying that his commentaries are not worthy of being consulted by him, and for that matter, not worthy of being consulted by a readership in the broader Latin-speaking world. Furthermore, and perhaps more interestingly, 2 of these Greek commentators seem very much out of place as cited sources in a commentary in which Jerome puts a very high premium on the refutation of heresy. One of these characters, one of these commentators, is Alexander, an otherwise unknown writer whom Jerome calls Vetus Hereticus, the ancient heretic. The other is Apollinaris of Laodicea, whom Jerome condemns in other contexts as a Christological heretic for overemphasizing Jesus' divinity at the expense of his humanity. Needless to say, the very presence of both Alexander and Apollinaris on Jerome's bibliography is extremely insinuative. Even an obscure heretic from centuries past and a more recent heretic are better interpretive guides to Paul than Victorinus. The issue of doctrinal orthodoxy aside, though, all 6 writers filling out Jerome's catalog share one essential trait in common. They all compose their commentaries in Greek. Herein lies, I would argue, another implicit criticism of Victorinus. Because Victorinus' Pauline Commentaries show no compelling evidence of acquaintance with the Greek exegetical tradition on Paul, modern scholars are heavily inclined to conclude that he in fact had no working knowledge of this tradition, which in practical terms of chronology means he had no working knowledge of Origen's writings on Paul. Whether or not Jerome assumes that Victorinus was ignorant of this Greek tradition, he nonetheless obliquely accuses him of arrogance for failing to use it as a hermeneutical guide, even as he congratulates himself for adopting it as his own guide. One of the most notable disparities between the commenting styles of Victorinus and Jerome is that Victorinus almost always provides a single interpretation for a given passage, whereas Jerome routinely presents the opinions of others alongside his own. Behind these differing methodologies lie 2 fundamentally opposing models for how to conduct biblical interpretation. In Jerome's view, the Latin exegete must not work in a linguistic vacuum, but rather must carry on a dialogue of sorts with his authoritative counterparts in the Greek tradition, most of all Origen. Jerome conceptualizes the act of biblical exegesis, then, as a cross-generational conversation, if you will, which kind of amounts to an intellectual extension of the notion of communio sanctorum. The unspoken assumption here is that the Latins are dwarves on the shoulders of Greek giants. To Jerome's perception, Victorinus was a dwarf, to be sure, yet he had no giant's shoulders on which to perch. Jerome, of course, portrays himself in a vastly different light, underscoring his own intimate access to the past and present luminaries of the Greek exegetical tradition. For instance, he affectionately dubs Didymus my seeing guide, videns meus, an allusion to both Didymus's legendary blindness and the fact that Jerome had attended Didymus's lectures in Alexandria in early 386, probably about 6 months before he began writing his own commentaries on Paul. But there's a problem. Many years later, Rufinus mocked Jerome for this kind of comment, for implying that he had been Didymus's disciple despite the fact that he spent so little time around Didymus. Rufinus says, quote, "You had not in your whole life spent more than 30 days in Alexandria, where Didymus lived. Yet, throughout your books, you boast loudly and often that you were the pupil of Didymus, and that he was the one who trained you in the Holy Scriptures," unquote. So, needless to say, Rufinus' taunt exposes the extremely illusory nature of Jerome's claim, and as if in a tacit admission of guilt, Jerome never refuted the charge. Now, of all the commentators listed in Jerome's catalog, it is Origen who is given clear pride of place. Not only is the notice devoted to him as long as all other 5 notices combined, but also Jerome identifies him as his chief model, explicitly noting that he has, quote, followed the commentaries of Origen. After then listing the other 5 exegetes, he gives a programmatic statement about how he interfaced with these sources. And this is the final bit under number 1 on the handout, and this is underlined, the underlined bit. Jerome says, "Even if I were to borrow just a little from these works, the result would be something praiseworthy. So then, let me frankly admit that I read all of these things and stored up in my mind an extraordinary number of them. Then I summoned my secretary and dictated both my own ideas and those of others, all the while paying no attention to the method, the words, or the opinions belonging to each." Okay, what to say about this? Jerome claims, in essence, not only to have read all of the Galatians commentaries listed here, but he also claims to have essentially memorized large portions of them before he began writing his own Galatians commentary. It's possible, but I guess anything's possible. I think the preferred explanation to ground things in historical reality is that Jerome accessed these commentaries almost certainly at the Ecclesiastical Library at Caesarea. He consulted these, perhaps in a cursory way, to get a sense of their overall merits, then perhaps copied them or had them copied, or worked at the library. We're not sure about the mechanics of how that worked. But the point is he claims to have memorized these things before he began writing his own commentary. I think in reality what happened is he worked through he read each commentator's comments on each lemmatized Pauline text as he went along. So Galatians 1:1, let's read all the comments by these various authors. Now I will write my own comments. So you see that Jerome is doing something very subtle, or perhaps not so subtle, to essentially heroicize himself as a scholar with essentially an encyclopedic mind, and really a command, an internalized command of the entire tradition on Paul, the patristic tradition anyway. Now, at the end of the preface to Book 1 of his commentary on Ephesians, which he composed immediately after the Galatians commentary, he elaborates further on his handling of Greek sources, and this is number 2 on the handout. He says, "I also alert you to the following in the preface, that you may know that Origen, whom I have followed in part, composed 3 volumes on this epistle, and that Apollinaris and Didymus also produced some modest commentaries. Although I have plucked a few things from these, I have added or removed some things as seemed fit to me. Consequently, the discerning reader may be aware from the very start that this work is both others and my own." Jerome again touts his close association with the Greek tradition, citing Origen as his principal model, while also crediting Didymus and Apollinaris secondarily. This time, though, instead of avowing that he has followed the commentaries of Origen, as he does in the Galatians preface, he admits only a partial reliance on Origen, specifying that he has followed him in part, ex parte. He also asserts his own exegetical originality and independence from all 3 of these named Greek exegetes as a group, when he claims that he has only, quote-unquote, plucked a few things from their commentaries and incorporated material from them at his own discretion. The resulting product is a Variorum commentary, which he characterizes as a work that is both others and my own. A good representative example of this method of work can be found in his comments on Ephesians 2:7, a verse which reads, "That he might show in the ages to come the abundant riches of his grace and kindness towards us in Christ Jesus." And this is number 3 on the handout, which I think is on the second, the back to the first page. Now we're not going to read through this whole passage, but I just wanted to note a couple of things about it. Now, about 15 years after Jerome wrote the commentary on Ephesians, he wrote his apology against Rufinus, and he identifies in this particular passage, he identifies the speakers. The first opinion, and I've inserted these for your reference too. The first paragraph is Jerome's own opinion. Now, he doesn't put this in the original commentary. He has to fess up to this after Rufinus confronts him about his manner of composing commentaries. So the first opinion is by Jerome, the second by Origen, and the third by Apollinaris. Now, even though he doesn't criticize Origen or Apollinaris by name, he does try to influence his readers in a very subtle way. And notice, first of all, that Jerome places his own opinion first among the 3. Now, in doing that, he's observing the norms of dispositio, the second of 5 canons of classical rhetoric, which is concerned with the proper arrangement of arguments within a given speech or writing. Now, according to the conventional wisdom, you should put your strongest argument first so that you can sway the audience to believe that, and then follow it with successively weaker arguments. So I think you see where I'm going with this. Jerome, in a very subtle way, has brought his sophistication as a rhetorician to bear on his exegesis, and without openly criticizing his Greek models, because if he had openly named them and criticized them, he would risk undermining his own authority, because he was the one who claimed to have consulted them and to have followed them. Okay, so far we've examined some of the nuances of how Jerome represents his critical engagement with his Greek sources, and especially Origen, to valorize his own exegetical authority. So continuing with this theme, let's come full circle and revisit the preface to Book 1 of his Galatians commentary, and that's the passage we began with. Now, as we reconsider Jerome's catalog of 6 authors he claims to have followed or consulted, it should be pointed out that he did not have to name any of them. There was no reason why he absolutely had to name them. After all, in the prefaces to his commentaries on Philemon and Titus, he doesn't name any sources. And almost every modern scholar is absolutely convinced that he's following Origen exclusively in those commentaries, but he doesn't name him. So why in the Galatians preface does he name him, and also all of these other Greek writers? Well, in answering this important question, we first have to consider how Jerome regarded his commentary on Galatians in the broader context of his exegetical work on Paul at that time. There are good reasons for supposing that he positioned it first in the sequence of commentaries on the 4 epistles, so that readers would encounter it and its prefaces before the other 3 commentaries and their respective prefaces. First of all, his grand pronouncement about the novelty of his undertaking is the kind of remark we normally find at the very beginning of an ancient literary work, or, as the case may be, at the beginning of the first in a collection of interconnected works, like these Pauline Commentaries. Furthermore, in the final chapter of his literary history, De Viris Illustribus, where he lists the titles of his principal writings down to the year 393, he places the Galatians commentary first in order of the 4 Pauline Commentaries, even though it was the second one he composed after the Philemon commentary. And that's number 4 on the handout. The first bit in Latin is how Jerome lists them, and then underneath is the chronological order, the actual chronological order. So his non-chronological listing here presumably is a sign of his prioritization of his Galatians commentary among his quartet of Pauline commentaries. Finally, the manuscript tradition provides a telling clue. In the manuscripts that contain all 4 commentaries, the one on Galatians almost always comes first, and this would appear to be a reflection of the internal structure imposed by Jerome on his archetype. In short, Jerome seems to have conceived the preface to Book 1 of his Galatians commentary to serve as the general prolegomenon to his entire Opus Paulinum, And as we saw earlier, it's this particular preface to this particular commentary that he designated to lead the charge in his ambitious attempt to supplant Marius Victorinus as the true expert on Paul among the Latins. For his Ephesians commentary, he consulted only 3 sources, Greek sources, Origen, Didymus, and Apollinaris. And for his Titus and Philemon commentaries, he consulted only 1 source, Origen. By contrast, for his Galatians commentary, he claims to have accessed commentaries by 6 different Greek writers, to say nothing of the rest of Origen's exegetical miscellanea on Galatians. Thus, the prologue to Book 1 of his Galatians commentary afforded him the ideal chance to discredit Victorinus for his apparent failure to engage with the Greek tradition. But why did Jerome feel the need to attack Victorinus at all? Well, I think personally that one of the main factors motivating his polemical impulse was a deeply felt insecurity. We have to keep in mind that Jerome's dismissal of Victorinus as a rank amateur in Pauline interpretation is ironic, to say the least. When Jerome composed his 4 Pauline commentaries in 386, he himself was very far from being the seasoned, world-renowned biblical sage he would become starting in the mid to late 390s. In fact, his Pauline commentaries constitute his first major effort at the systematic exegesis of whole biblical books. So, contrary to the impression he gives by his self-confident rhetoric, the little practical experience Jerome had accrued leading up to 386 made him, realistically speaking, not much more than an amateur himself. But it wasn't just that Jerome was attacking the legacy of Marius Victorinus, the commentator on Paul. Victorinus had been the most prominent professor of rhetoric in mid-4th century Rome, holding its public chair of rhetoric under the Emperor Constantius. In 354, he was elevated to the senatorial order, becoming a vir clarissimus, and a statue in his honor was even erected in Trajan's Forum. A year or 2 later, late in life, he converted to Christianity, and within another year, he became an outspoken advocate of Nicene orthodoxy, writing treatises against the Arians, followed later by his commentaries on Paul. Decades after his death, Victorinus was still fondly remembered for being a pivotal figure in 4th century Latin Christianity. For instance, in the 8th book of his Confessions, Augustine cites him as a model for his own conversion. So in short, Victorinus' legacy was rock solid and time-tested, at least in Augustine's view, and probably many others. By stark contrast, the legacy that Jerome had built for himself down to the summer of 386, when he was about 40 years old and trying his own hand at Pauline interpretation, was anything but distinguished. During his recent 3-year stay in Rome, from 382 to 385, his reputation as an up-and-coming biblical scholar took a very hard hit. His revision of the old Latin Gospels according to the Greek, despite having been commissioned by Pope Damasus, was criticized severely in many quarters for being a dangerous novelty. To complicate matters further, by the summer of 385, during his final months in Rome, he had become dogged by rumors and innuendo that he was using his profession of monasticism as a way to seduce women ascetics of the Christian aristocracy to gain access to their fortunes and bedchambers. As I've argued elsewhere, because he was an ordained priest, a non-practicing priest, but still an ordained priest, the Roman Episcopal Court intervened and handed down a verdict which amounted to his expulsion from its diocese. It's a little more complicated than that, but I don't want to get into that now. So, by the time Jerome began composing his Pauline commentaries the following summer, he was, in all historical reality, a disgraced cleric and fledgling biblical scholar, newly installed in Bethlehem, at the time anyway, a tiny agrarian village situated hundreds of miles from his former base of operations, Rome. Rome was where most of his literary patrons still resided, including Marcella, to whom he makes flattering overtures in his Pauline prefaces, in the stated hope that she will act as his literary surrogate, literary agent, if you will, and use her influence there locally to ensure a positive reception for his writings once they reach Italy's shores. Rome also was the city where Marius Victorinus, although he had died 2.5 decades earlier, was still a revered intellectual icon in the local Christian community, and held the distinction of being the first Latin-speaking Christian on record to comment systematically on Paul. Needless to say, his was a formidable legacy that any aspiring Pauline commentator in Latin had to contend with. But when confronting this legacy, Jerome refused to concede to Victorinus his seminal place in the history of Latin Pauline exegesis. Instead, with what we might call his characteristic bravado, he heralded his own work on Paul as something unprecedented in the Latin world. To believe his revisionist account, the relatively young tradition of the Pauline commentary in Latin had made a false start with Victorinus, and what it needed now was not reinvigoration or a breath of fresh air. It needed a completely new beginning. The literary historian in him accordingly reconfigured this tradition, stripping Victorinus of his canonical status within it and anachronistically conferring this status on himself. As I've tried to argue today, he justified this radical move in part to supersede Victorinus and to be recognized as the premier authority on Paul in the Latin-speaking world by hitching his wagon to the Greek exegetical tradition, and especially to Origen, whom he famously hailed as the preeminent teacher of the churches after the apostles. Thank you.